My name is John Niedermann. I'm a Deputy District Attorney for the County of Los Angeles. Dr. Tseng opened a practice with her husband in a strip mall in Rowland Heights, California, called Advanced Care AAA. He focused on seeing family patients and geriatrics. She was a doctor of osteopathy, which means that she basically was focusing on holistic types of medicine as opposed to writing prescriptions. Over the course of a few years, her clientele changed to where she was writing prescriptions for a large number of younger people who were traveling 30, 40 miles at a time to see her and get large amounts of medication for which they didn't need, which they would pay for her in cash. There were complaints from parents of these kids that they did not think it was legitimate that their child was driving basically from Orange County up to Los Angeles to see Dr. Tseng. So they made a complaint with the California Medical Board. The medical board is required to look into consumer complaints, and based upon their initial investigation, they believed that they had sufficient evidence to show that some of the prescriptions Dr. Tseng was writing were not for legitimate medical reasons. And so they presented the case to us to see if we would file criminal charges based upon that prescribing habit. We were aware of 5 or 6 overdose deaths associated with her practice, but at the time the case was referred to us, we were not considering homicide charges. We were considering simply filing either illegal prescribing or over-prescribing on the part of Lisa Tseng. From filing to verdict, it took 3 years. Here in California, we have 2 ways of taking someone to trial, either going through the grand jury or going through a preliminary hearing, a probable cause hearing. In general, our probable cause hearings last a few hours on a typical case. Dr. Tseng's prelim lasted 4.5 weeks in a long cause court. The trial itself lasted almost 2 months. We put on almost 80 witnesses. We had over 300 exhibits. So it was an extremely complicated trial to put on with a lot of moving parts. So I would have to say this is one of the most complicated trials that I've put on. The result was Dr. Tseng was convicted of all but one of the felonies we filed, including 3 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. Ironically enough, she had no reaction. As they're reading the guilty verdict, she kind of stared off into space. And the interesting thing is, every doctor that I've prosecuted has had the same reaction. They either look like they have no idea what's going on or absolutely indignant that we would ever file criminal charges against them. So there seems to be this sort of universal hubris with physicians that how dare we second guess what they're doing, and even more so, prosecute them for their behavior. So after the verdict's read, we come back 3 months later for victim impact statement and sentencing. And this is an opportunity for the parents and families of the victims to speak directly to the defendant, to tell her the impact of what her actions have had on their family, on their lives, and then the judge issues what he believes the proper sentence should be. They were standing room only, and we had parent after parent come up to say how their lives were destroyed, how they lost their jobs, how their marriages broke up because of the death of their kid. And I'm watching the defendant, nothing. Not a smirk, not a tear, not a flinch, absolutely nothing. And I think at that very point, that's when I knew this was a proper verdict. If you have someone falling apart on the stand and you have a defendant who isn't even reacting to what's going on, that's, in my opinion, a maligned heart. That is the definition of implied malice. We really weren't concerned about what the sentence was going to be. We were more concerned about sending a message, and that message being, if you prescribe illegally, and if your patients die from those prescriptions, we will hold you responsible for murder. Would I do it again? Yes. Could I do it again? I don't know. What changed it to a homicide case was basically just a little bit of footwork. So they had executed a search warrant on the clinic and they had seized computers. I think she had something like 1,600 different patient profiles. And I noticed that on certain profiles, there was language to the extent of the coroner called Dr. Sang and said, this patient died of an overdose. Coroner called Dr. Sang to say this person died. And I kept hitting that over and over and over again, and I would actually call up my investigator like on a Saturday night at 9 o'clock. We found another death. And after 3 or 4 days of just going through each individual patient profile, I found more than a dozen of her patients had overdosed and died, and that she'd received notification of it because there were notes in the computer indicating somebody called her to say, this patient overdosed, coroner wants to know what you were prescribing to them. So I thought to myself, okay, here's someone who's being told, death, death, death. Responsible person would be like, whoa, hold on. Maybe I ought to change how I'm doing things because this is having an adverse reaction to my clients. Nope, she did the exact opposite. She started increasing. So that kind of gave me the idea, you know what? Let's look into homicide. Let's look into seeing whether we can hold her responsible for all of these deaths because she just doesn't care. I mean, she doesn't care at all. This is business for her. So that's when we started developing a homicide theory and seeing if we can put it together. I think you need to cover every angle because the angle you don't cover is the angle the defense will take. Certainly, you're dealing with an unsympathetic victim. So you have someone who is a drug abuser or a drug addict who's going to a doctor to fool them into giving them a prescription, one that they're readily asking for and willing to pay for, and an individual then who goes out and abuses the medication, takes it not as is directed by the physician, and overdoses. That's not a sympathetic person to most people in society. We tend to look down upon addicts. We tend to basically tell ourselves they got what they deserved. And who are we then to hold a physician responsible for what an addict chooses to do with that medication? So one of the pitfalls is an unsympathetic victim. And one of the first things that I do when I'm talking to the jury before the case, I ask them about addiction issues. I ask them about personal responsibility. I ask them whether they hold doctors to be special, like clergy or policemen. There are certain professions that we have that we're trained from a young age to respect and to defer to, and whether they would be able to hold physicians responsible for their behavior, but also whether they think addiction is a disease, whether they think someone gets what they deserve if they overdose. I think those are all questions that we don't think about that we need to think about. I would suggest that going for a murder is like seeing the dodo bird. You're lucky if it happens once. This case was so outside the pale and yet was still novel in how it was being charged. We took every painstaking, careful step we could to put this together to make sure it would result in a conviction or be successful. I wouldn't recommend filing a homicide charge against a doctor lightly at all. I would say be very, very careful. File the charges you truly believe that you can prove, and if there is a chance that you can't prove a certain charge, for your own credibility, for the strength of your case, only file those that you absolutely believe you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Don't take a risk, don't take a chance with a charge you don't think will fly.